along the way, as the Greek team was thinking about this session, we had a lot of heated debates. Measurement and impact assessment is fraught with all sorts of really lots of complexity. It's important to do, and we know why we need to do it, and yet there are a lot of challenges in doing it. So we wanted to have a session that would sort of elicit some of the debates. So this is meant to be kind of chargé, if you will, among the panelists. And then once I've asked a series of questions, you can ask some provocative questions also to the panelists. So don't be shy and don't hold back. So our MOOC is called Social Learning for Social Impact, and we asked ourselves the same questions. How do we evaluate our own success? How do we know if we've done our job? And on one hand, we could say, well, if we launch a Grameen Bank or a Khan Academy as a result of a group of people who've done the MOOC with us, that's great. But then how would we evaluate what the social learning part was, which is part of the core mission of this MOOC as well? So let's take it back to the very beginning of the day. Henry mentioned that nobody buys a house thinking about how efficient the house is. They buy it for a whole bunch of other qualitative reasons. Same reason we choose restaurants. It's not because it's efficient, it's because the food is delicious or it's a great ambiance. So some inputs and some impacts just can't be measured. And yet we feel we have to measure them. So what do we have to say about this?
I'm concerned that there's a kind of very strong tendency in the world today to look for measures and numbers and things. And I'm a big-time number guy. I can cite you numbers about everything under the sun. I remember Bob Feller's fastball was 94 miles an hour, and he was a pitcher like 300 years ago. So I'm not against numbers at all. I'm just against numbers driving out other forces, even in business, which is clearly based on numbers. It's all about profit and stock price and all that. Even in business, I think an overemphasis on quantification is killing businesses. I mean, the whole idea of executive bonuses is destroying a lot of businesses because they're trying to figure out numerical ways to reward people for their performance, except their performance can only be assessed after 10 years or more because of the positions they're in. So if you pay them short term, and it's the only way you can, then you've got distorted measures. So it's almost a scourge in some sense, not the idea of measuring, but the obsession with measuring. That's my concern. And when you get to the plural sector, where it's really qualitative, a lot of it, just big concern.
I'll take the liberty of speaking next because I hate baseball statistics. One of the other things you said is if we create a new Grameen Bank or some equivalent as a result of the MOOC, we'll feel like maybe we've succeeded. But I think it speaks to one of the problems that we have when we do measure, and that is, let's say there's some folks out there who have watched our MOOC, and let's say it's either those same folks or perhaps others who do create another like initiative. How are we to know whether it was a result of this MOOC? How are we to know that there weren't 900 other things that came in that time period that contributed to it? And it's one of the things I learned when I was working in the state of Washington, when we tried to get organizations to think about if you had one thing to measure, how would you communicate that? How would you measure it? It's so difficult when you are out of the very narrow range that you can control, and you'll resonate with this, to going out to the range where you might have influence, going out to the range where there's so many other players in the picture that it's very hard to determine who contributed what. So I think it's really difficult, but I also think we can't just let go the phrase, what I do, you can't measure. So
I'm attracted to measurement when it is a compelling expression of your aspiration. There is a concreteness to that starts an exchange that is different than other forms of expression. You know, math is a language, and it doesn't work for everyone, but the purpose of language is to communicate and to connect. And to the extent that that expression can be used to clarify, then it is wonderful. And like any tool, it can be used for good or for evil. And certainly, it is, I am so appreciative to my colleagues and to all of you for being willing to call out the perversions, because those fears are what is keeping us from these expressions of what we are trying to do that is valuable. It is the fear, right? So what is the difference between accountability and ownership? The difference is co-creation. That's what transforms this distorted field of accountability, where it's like, what? You doubt? You doubt that I'm creating something of value? And as soon as that seed of doubt is planted, then that fear grows and people become farther and farther away from themselves or their mission. And that makes me sad, because I see in you the value that you are desiring to express and want you to have compelling ways of expressing that, and to be fabulously curious about your failures and your successes, and what you can learn from that to create more social good.
I think that I'm also persuaded about the value of performance measures, recognizing that they have been inappropriately used. The value of performance measures, based in part upon my now almost 40 years involvement with the plural sector. You know, in the 70s, when I first got into working in the nonprofit sector, when there wasn't a lot of attention to performance, there frankly were a lot of organizations that weren't very good. I mean, the service they were providing was just not that good. You know, that people were getting served, but you know, some of these organizations just weren't that good. And I think if you look at take the long view of the kind of increase in attention to performance that in certain fields that I've been associated with for a long time, such as social services or healthcare, that to me there's no question that overall the services are better now, partly because we've been paying more attention to performance. So I've also seen, I think, taking the long view, some of the benefits that more attention to performance and measurement has had on the plural sector. But again, I'm the first one to admit that the focus on measures has also had sometimes unintended consequences that are not good for the organizations themselves or for the local communities.
So one of the big critiques I'm hearing in this space is that this need for measurement and impact assessment is actually impeding innovation. And this is how it's coming up, where organizations are wanting to launch new programs or take a bit of a risk, but they know at the end of the day that they're going to have to evaluate the programming that they launched, and subsequent funding is contingent on the success of a program. So you've got these like very interesting reports that are reporting on success when the success is questionable, and there's just a reticence to actually really push the envelope because there's so much attention paid. Comments on this?
Asking about when measurement gets in the way of innovation?
Yes.
I'll say something first, because that's a time as a instructor I'd like to have a marker in my hand to be standing next to a whiteboard. But I have two curves on a graph that I draw when I talk about this, and it's they've come from a colleague I had when I was at the Kennedy School. And they are two performance curves. And to get from, you are on the highest point, imagine, on a performance curve, if you're measuring your performance in whatever way you're measuring it or in whatever way you're describing it. And if you want to go really over the top and be innovative and get to a much higher point, you would be on a different curve. You would no longer be on the curve that's being measured. So they're two distinct curves, and they're not connected. And the point is, in order to get from one curve to the second curve, you're going from A, let's say, to A prime. Since the curves are disconnected, there's a drop. And you could fall off the curve, or you could make it up to the next curve. And the dip, where you could fall off, is the risk. And so it really speaks to, can organizations provide the environment for innovation to happen? Are they willing to take the risk and let the people who work in the organizations try to achieve that innovation by accepting that there might be failure in there? So I wish I could draw these to show them to you. It came from some work by a man called Herman quote-unquote Dutch Leonard at the Kennedy School.
I can draw them. If you take Leslie's classes, eventually you'll want to get it tattooed right here, the performance curves. It looks good.
You know, there's a joke about a judge in the old times in his chamber, and there's a dispute, and one person comes in and explains the whole story, and the judge says, "You've got a very good point there," and he leaves, and the other guy comes in, contradicts the first guy totally from beginning to end, and the judge says, "You've got a very good point there." And so the assistant who's been listening to this says, "You heard contradictory, diametrically opposed stories, and you told them both they have a good point there." And the judge says to the assistant, "You know, you've got a good point there." and that's my feeling about all the comments here. I agree with everything.
But terrible debate.
So much for Chargé.
But
Turning back to the debate. A couple more questions, and then maybe there'll be some questions from the participants. I'm going to actually cluster 3 questions into my final question because I really think that these guys are smart and want to ask some questions of their own. What value does learning have in assessment? What value does storytelling have as part of the assessment process? And what value does relationships have in the whole assessment process?
So, I think that to me, to do assessment well, you have to be able to kind of create a learning organization. I mean, this is, I guess building on Peter Senge and many others, but I think you need to build a learning organization. You need to engage people in ways that where they feel ownership of the assessment process.
I think that folks are looking for ways to connect with one another, and that something that keeps them apart is a difference in expectation. So finding a way to express what you expect will happen as a result of something that you are doing or the reason that you are coming together is a way of closing that gap. And that could be between, Leslie and I, both of whom might respond to phone calls about an instance of child abuse in a home and have very different levels of experience or judgment about what we see when we come into that home and whether it is time to remove that child or what is the right way to support this family to heal the wounds that gave rise to the abuse in the first place. Now, our expressions are informed by our experience, right? There needs to be a way for us to close the gap between what we know so that we can share that experience. And I suspect that this overemphasis on measurement is a result of a frustration or a sense that that's not what I expected or this isn't meeting expectations. That casts such a pallor on that whole relationship that I think is false. It doesn't need to be there. We don't need to assume. As soon as you feel like the word imposed, right? Measures that are imposed, immediately just the choice of that verb implies that there's a villain, right? Can't have imposition without a villain. As soon as there's a villain in your story, there's a victim. Oh, now we're the victim. Now you have this drama going on that's pulling apart and separating where you could potentially break out of that disempowering view or frame by really talking about, well, what do we expect and how will we get there? And what story are we telling ourselves about where we are the way we are today? What is the barrier in our belief system that is preventing us from achieving this vision that we want? And how would you know if we got there? I do believe that you can tell when you're in an experience of mutual respect, and you can tell when you are not. And you just have that feeling. We all have that radar. The thing that separates us from embracing our reality or being able to feel free to express a difference of opinion are the stories that we tell ourselves based on the facts, right? So there's always this interplay between the fact and the story. So early on, when folks were just starting to work so hard, like gerbils in a cage, producing these performance reports and kind of feeding the beast, and we have 900 measures we have to report on, and we have 7 sponsors or donors, each of whom requires 40 different measures. That's 7 times 4. I mean, you just go crazy, and you're not even focused on your mission anymore, and you just have this gnawing feeling that we're doing all this because they don't trust us, right? And they don't see the value that we're producing. And all of that is a story that you're telling yourself based on a fact, that you either saw or observed or your experience. So that feeling of closeness and appreciation and trust has roots in choices, behaviors that you can change yourself. So I just want to invite, when I'm inviting you, I'm really inviting myself, Think again about what story I'm telling myself, about the reason that person even asked me that question, right? What do you think what change will you make in the world? And, depending on who's asking you, you are already telling yourself a story about why they're asking you and what they're going to do to you or for you or with you as a result of your answer to that particular question.